February 11, 1978, Cranbrook, British Columbia. A Boeing 737 touches down in heavy snow. The captain deploys the thrust reversers. 2 seconds later, he sees a snowplow directly ahead. He slams the throttles forward to go around. The left reverser doesn't close. The hydraulics cut out. The bucket doors blow open in the airstream. Within 20 seconds, 43 people are dead. The snowplow was supposed to be off the runway 5 minutes before the aircraft arrived. But the aircraft arrived 10 minutes early. Not because it was fast, because the estimated arrival time sent to Cranbrook was 10 minutes wrong. And the one radio call that would have corrected it was never made. To understand how two entirely separate chains of failure converged on the same runway at the same moment, you have to go back to that same afternoon at Calgary, Alberta. Pacific Western Airlines, PWA, was a regional carrier owned by the provincial government of Alberta, connecting cities across the vast interior of Western and Northern Canada. Short hops between small towns, often in bad weather, often to airports without control towers. It was bread and butter flying, Edmonton to Fort McMurray, Calgary to Cranbrook, Cranbrook to Castlegar, linking communities that would otherwise have no scheduled airline service. The aircraft that did most of this work was the Boeing 737-200, one of the earliest variants of the 737 family, with its distinctive cigar-shaped Pratt & Whitney JT8D engines mounted under swept wings. It was sturdy enough for gravel strips, reliable enough for Arctic cold, and small enough to operate economically into airports that wouldn't see a jet otherwise. The 737 that would operate Flight 314 was nearly 8 years old, registration Charlie, Foxtrot, Papa, Whiskey, Charlie, and in good working condition. The captain was 30 years old, with about 5,200 hours total, more than half on the 737. He had been with PWA since 1967 and had earned his command the previous year. He knew this route well. Calgary to Cranbrook was one of the airline's most frequently flown legs, taking about 23 minutes almost every time. His first officer was 25 with 1,300 hours and just 81 on the 737, essentially brand new on type. The experience gap was significant, but for a routine short flight into a familiar airport, it would not normally matter. They reviewed their briefing material and noted that Cranbrook was reporting heavy snowfall, almost a meter of snow on the ground, with visibility 3/4 of a mile, about 1,200 meters. Not unusual for the Rocky Mountains in February. Cranbrook had a proper ILS to runway 16 with full approach lighting and a non-directional beacon at Skookumchuck, serving as the initial approach fix. The weather was well within limits. There was no question about whether they would go. 3 cabin crew helped board 44 passengers. At 12:32 local time, Flight 314 lifted off from Calgary and climbed toward flight level 200. And at that moment, in the Calgary control tower, the first link in the chain began to take shape. It was standard practice for Calgary ATC to transmit an estimated time of arrival to the destination whenever an aircraft departed. For Cranbrook, this meant estimating when the aircraft would cross the Skookum beacon. But the ATC manual provided no clear method for calculating this estimate. It simply said, estimated time of arrival over the approach aid to be used, with no guidance on how to account for weather, routing, or approach procedures. Each controller used slightly different assumptions. The result was that ETAs for Cranbrook were routinely inaccurate, sometimes by a wide margin. PWA's own internal estimate for Flight 314, based on years of operational data, was 12:55. Calgary ATC calculated 13:05, a 10-minute difference. PWA's estimate was passed to their ground agent in Cranbrook for passenger handling, but it was never shared with the aeradio station. Calgary's estimate was the only number transmitted to the people who needed it most. 10 minutes wrong. That number would now govern everything that happened on the ground. Inside the cabin, 44 passengers settled in for the short hop over the Canadian Rockies. Some were connecting to Castlegar, the next stop on the route. Others were heading home to Cranbrook after business in Calgary. A few may have glanced out the windows at the peaks sliding past beneath low gray clouds and falling snow. The cabin crew worked a quick beverage service. There was barely time for more on a 23-minute flight. Up front, the 2 pilots climbed to cruise altitude, And just 4 minutes later, the first officer was already requesting descent. A flight so short that the cruise phase was little more than a pause between climb and descent. And somewhere in that compressed timeline, between the takeoff from Calgary and the approach into Cranbrook, a series of small decisions and non-decisions would begin to accumulate, each one insignificant on its own, each one closing a door that could not be reopened. Now, to understand why that 10-minute error mattered so much, you need to know what was happening on the ground at Cranbrook while Flight 314 was still in the air. Cranbrook Airport had no control tower. Instead, it had an air radio station, a position that provided advisory information to aircraft and coordinated ground vehicle movements, but without the authority to issue clearances or instructions. The air radio operator on duty had held the position for 5 years. He was experienced with the routine. A snowplow was out on runway 16, clearing the continuous snowfall between scheduled arrivals. The air radio operator's manual recommended calling the snowplow off the runway about 5 minutes before an aircraft's expected arrival. He had been told to expect Flight 314 at 13:05, so he planned to clear the runway at 1300, 5 minutes before the estimated arrival. The problem was that Flight 314 would actually arrive at 12:55. 5 minutes before the air radio operator even planned to call the snowplow off. The aircraft would be on the ground while the snowplow was still working. But neither the air radio operator nor the snowplow driver knew this. The air radio operator's manual had never been cross-referenced against the way ATC calculated ETAs. Calgary's controllers had no idea their estimates were being used to separate aircraft from ground vehicles. The two systems, ATC and air radio, had developed their practices independently, with no formal interface between them, and the gap between those practices was exactly 10 minutes wide. There was one safeguard that could have closed that gap: the pilots themselves. It was customary for crews approaching Cranbrook to report crossing the Skookum Beacon, the initial approach fix, located about 7 minutes of flight time from the runway. If Flight 314 had made that call, the air radio operator would have instantly realized the aircraft was 7 minutes away, not 20, and he would have ordered the snowplow off the runway immediately. Every other crew that flew into Cranbrook made this report. It was the universal expectation, but it was not legally required. The guidance recommended position reports at uncontrolled airports, but the recommendation had no regulatory force. A pilot could skip it and face no legal consequence. And on this day, that distinction became the difference between a clear runway and a blocked one. And here is where the cockpit culture enters the story, in a way that would generate controversy for years. As Flight 314 descended through 18,000 feet and the first officer contacted Cranbrook Air Radio, the captain was not listening to that frequency. His radio was tuned to a company channel, and he was chatting with another PWA pilot about the stock market and other casual matters. In 1978, the sterile cockpit rule did not exist. There was no prohibition against off-topic conversation during descent. PWA's culture was informal. Its pilots flew these short routes so often that complacency had become systemic rather than personal. But the immediate consequence was concrete. When the air radio operator mentioned the snowplow, the captain heard nothing. The air radio operator's wording was ambiguous. He said the sweeper had been out for some time, trying to keep the snow back, and that he would provide a progress report from the driver. The correct interpretation was that the snowplow was currently operating on the runway, but another reading, equally plausible in a noisy, distraction-filled cockpit, was that the sweeper had previously been out, and the operator was checking on what had been done. The first officer acknowledged with 314 checks. Whether he understood the snowplow was still on the runway, whether he processed the information at all, whether he tried to relay it to the captain, we will never know. The cockpit voice recorder was destroyed in the post-crash fire. What we do know is that this was the last transmission Flight 314 made before landing. The crew never reported crossing the Skookum Beacon. They never called final approach. They never requested an update on the snowplow's status. The air radio operator waited for the beacon report. When it didn't come, he assumed the aircraft was still far away. The ETA of 1305 remained his only reference. The snowplow stayed on the runway. And Flight 314, invisible in the falling snow, was now less than 5 minutes from touchdown. If you're enjoying this video, please take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell. It helps us bring you more stories like this one. Now, to understand the second chain, the one that turned an avoidable collision into a fatal crash, you need to know how thrust reversers work on the Boeing 737-200, and specifically, how a design flaw in their lockout mechanism would seal the fate of everyone on board. Thrust reversers on the 737-200 are bucket-style doors that fold over the rear of each engine to redirect exhaust forward, helping the aircraft decelerate after landing. They are loud and dramatic. Passengers feel them every time, but they are actually just a braking assist. Most of the real deceleration comes from the wheel brakes. Still, on a slippery runway covered in snow, thrust reversers can make the difference between stopping safely and overrunning the end. Nearly every transport jet has them. To deploy the reversers, the pilot first brings the thrust levers to idle, eliminating forward thrust, then lifts the reverser levers, which are physically attached to the thrust levers, to command the hydraulic actuators to fold the bucket doors into position over the engine exhaust. Once the doors are fully deployed, moving the reverser levers further spools up the engines, generating reverse thrust. To stow the reversers after landing, the pilot moves the reverser levers back to their resting position, which reduces power and commands the hydraulic system to fold the bucket doors back to their stowed position behind the engine. Two safety systems prevented dangerous configurations. First, a mechanical cam linkage was supposed to prevent forward thrust from being applied while the reverser doors were open, so a pilot could not accidentally combine forward power with open bucket doors. Second, an air-ground interlock cut hydraulic power to the reverser actuators whenever the weight-on-wheels switches sensed the aircraft was airborne. This prevented the reversers from being deployed in flight, which would be catastrophic on a two-engine aircraft. The problem was in the cam. A solenoid-based system would have provided a binary choice: doors closed, forward thrust allowed; doors not closed, forward thrust blocked. But the rotating cam created a gradual, analog transition. As the bucket doors approached the stowed position, the last 4 or 5 centimeters of travel, the cam would begin releasing the lockout, allowing the thrust levers to move forward proportionally. This meant a pilot could start pushing the thrust levers before the doors were fully closed. Under normal circumstances, this was a fraction of a second issue. The hydraulics would finish closing the doors almost instantly. But in one specific scenario, it became lethal. If the pilot rotated to go around while the doors were in that 4-centimeter gap, the main gear would lift off, the weight on wheels switches would trip, and the air-ground interlock would cut hydraulic power to the reverser actuators. The doors would freeze in whatever position they were in, almost closed, but not quite, and the force of the airstream hitting that gap would push the bucket doors back open. The de-energized actuators could not resist. Boeing knew about this discrepancy. In 1977, they added a caution to the Flight Crew Operations Manual, explicitly warning that attempting a go-around after deploying thrust reversers could result in one or more reversers getting stuck open. Going around after reverser deployment had always been prohibited across the industry, not only because of the mechanical risk, but because the time needed to stow the reversers, spool the engines back up, and accelerate to flying speed made a successful go-around extremely unlikely on most runway lengths. But PWA pilots were widely aware that some of their colleagues had successfully done it on multiple occasions, creating an informal belief that the maneuver was dangerous but possible. This kind of gap between the written prohibition and the operational culture is one of the most insidious threats in aviation, because it erodes the absolute nature of the rule without anyone consciously deciding to do so. There was also an emergency procedure for the specific scenario of a reverser deploying in flight. On the rear overhead panel, behind and above the pilots, 2 thrust reverser override switches, each protected by a guard and a witness wire, could restore hydraulic power to the reverser actuators in flight, allowing the pilot to command the doors back to the stowed position. But using these switches required reaching up and behind the seat, finding the correct switch by feel or by turning to look, breaking the witness wire, and flipping the guard. In a calm cockpit at cruise altitude, this would take maybe 10 seconds. In a cockpit where the aircraft is yawing violently at 200 feet, the captain has a fractured thumb, and the ground is 20 seconds away. it is almost impossible. At 12:55, 10 minutes before the air radio operator expected them, 5 minutes before he planned to clear the snowplow, Flight 314 broke through the falling snow and touched down on runway 16, about 800 feet past the threshold. The captain deployed the reversers. The bucket doors opened. Reverse thrust built. 2 seconds after touchdown, he sees the snowplow, 1,000 feet ahead, facing away, its brush throwing a plume of snow that camouflages it against the white runway. The snowplow driver catches the 737 in his rearview mirror and swerves, but there is no time. The captain acts on reflex. Go around. He begins stowing the reversers and slams the thrust levers forward. In the violence of the moment, the startle, the surge of adrenaline, possibly the first officer also grabbing the thrust levers, the captain fractures his thumb. But the bigger problem is invisible. The left reverser bucket doors have not fully closed. They are 4 or 5 centimeters short of stowed. The cam has already partially released. The thrust levers move forward. At the same instant, the captain rotates. The main gear lifts off. The weight on wheels switches trip. Hydraulic power to the reverser actuators cuts out. The airstream hits the 4-centimeter gap and pushes the left bucket doors open. The de-energized hydraulic actuators cannot resist the aerodynamic force. Within seconds, the left thrust reverser is fully deployed in flight. A safety system detects this and snaps the left thrust lever back to idle, preventing the development of full reverse thrust. But the open bucket doors create enormous asymmetric drag on the left side, while the right engine is producing full forward power. The aircraft yaws sharply to the left. The 737 clears the snowplow by about 50 feet, still climbing but losing speed rapidly. The driver exclaims, "Where the hell did he come from?" Both pilots apply right rudder and right aileron to counteract the yaw and roll. The aircraft is technically controllable. Boeing simulations later confirmed this, but only if the crew immediately retracts the flaps and landing gear to reduce drag and allow the aircraft to accelerate. In the chaos of the moment, the startle, the fractured thumb, the confusion of a reverser deploying in a maneuver that should never have been attempted, neither pilot does this. The flaps remain at 25 degrees. The gear remains down. The aircraft is in a maximum drag configuration with massive asymmetric thrust, and its speed is bleeding away with every second. As the speed drops, the authority of the rudder and ailerons drops with it. The pilots are fighting a losing battle. Investigators later found the guard over the left thrust reverser override switch was open, and its witness wire broken. The right switch was untouched. This suggests that one of the pilots, most likely the first officer, saw the thrust reverser warning light on the instrument panel and attempted to follow the emergency procedure. To reach the switch, he would have needed to turn in his seat, look up and behind, identify the correct switch among the overhead panel, break the witness wire, open the guard, and flip the switch, all while the aircraft was yawing violently. The instruments were spinning, and the ground was rising toward them. In the process of reaching for that switch, the first officer may have momentarily lifted his foot off the right rudder pedal, or his knee may have accidentally pressed the left pedal. In either case, the right rudder input was briefly lost. The switch itself was never actually moved. Whoever reached for it did not get that far. The momentary loss of rudder input is fatal. The aircraft yaws sharply left, then rolls past the point of recovery. Someone keys the radio. We're going to crash. Someone stomps back on the right rudder. Someone begins retracting the flaps toward 15. It is too late. The 737 rolls past 90 degrees to the left and strikes the ground beyond the departure end of runway 16. Less than 20 seconds have passed since the start of the go-around. The front of the aircraft breaks apart. The center wing section explodes as the fuel tanks ignite. The tail section comes to rest, mostly intact. 6 people survive: a flight attendant, 4 passengers who escape from the tail, and 1 passenger thrown clear while still strapped in his seat, landing in the deep snow. Firefighters wade through meter-deep snow on foot to reach the wreckage. There is almost nothing left of the forward cabin. 43 of the 49 people on board are killed. The investigation was conducted by the Aviation Safety Investigation Division of Transport Canada and audited by the Aircraft Accident Review Board. The cockpit voice recorder was destroyed by fire. The flight data recorder was damaged but partially readable. Boeing simulations confirmed the aircraft would have been controllable with one engine at idle reverse and the other at full forward thrust, but only in a gear-up, flaps 15 configuration. With the gear down and flaps at 25 degrees, level flight was not possible. If the left reverser had not deployed, the go-around would have succeeded. The contributing factors spanned 3 separate domains. In the communications chain, Calgary ATC's ETA was 10 minutes wrong. The air radio operator relied on that ETA for snowplow scheduling. The pilots failed to report crossing the Skookum beacon, and the entire interface between ATC and air radio ground vehicle coordination had never been formalized or cross-checked. In the cockpit, the captain was distracted by off-topic conversation and missed the snowplow advisory, and neither pilot made the customary position reports. In the aircraft design, the thrust reverser cam lockout allowed forward thrust before full stow, and the air-ground interlock could freeze the doors in transit, leaving them vulnerable to aerodynamic forces. The investigation generated significant controversy. Several members of the investigation team later told an independent review board that the captain's off-topic conversation during descent should have been listed as a contributing factor in the final report. It was not, and at least one investigator stated that this omission resulted from pressure applied by PWA. The independent review characterized the pilot's behavior as unprofessional and poorly disciplined, but it also acknowledged that the real problem was not personal failings, but the absence of a sterile cockpit philosophy and an overly casual culture at PWA that had been allowed to develop over years of routine operations without consequence. The fact that the captain felt comfortable chatting about the stock market during an instrument approach in 3/4-mile visibility tells you more about the airline's culture than about the captain himself. The FAA's design approval of the thrust reverser lockout system also came under scrutiny. Investigators noted that the cam-based lockout was inherently inferior to a solenoid design that would provide a binary lock, either fully locked or fully unlocked. The gradual release of the cam created a window of vulnerability that, while small, was entirely predictable. Boeing had known about this since at least 1977. The Flight Crew Operations Manual warning was a band-aid, not a fix. The accident generated lasting change across multiple domains of aviation. Canada became one of the only countries to require manufacturers to demonstrate in certification testing that their aircraft could safely perform a go-around after thrust reverser deployment, a requirement now known worldwide as the Cranbrook maneuver, named after the small town in the Rockies where 43 people lost their lives. Regulations governing communications and position reporting at uncontrolled airports were formalized and given regulatory force. What had been good airmanship became law. The interface between ATC estimates and air radio ground vehicle coordination was standardized and cross-referenced, closing the gap that had allowed a 10-minute error to go undetected. Modern thrust reverser systems use solenoid-based lockouts that provide the binary choice the cam never could. Doors closed means forward thrust allowed. Doors not closed means forward thrust blocked, with no ambiguous transition in between. And the sterile cockpit rule, adopted in the years following this and other accidents, now prohibits off-topic conversation during critical phases of flight, including taxi, takeoff, landing, and all operations below 10,000 feet. The rule exists because of flights like this one, where a casual conversation about the stock market meant the captain never heard that a snowplow was sitting on the runway he was about to land on. The snowplow driver, Terry George, was initially blamed by many in the Cranbrook community. He was later cleared of all responsibility. He had done nothing wrong. The air radio operator had never told him to leave the runway because, as far as the air radio operator knew, the aircraft was still 20 minutes away. In the minutes after the crash, before George had even recovered from the shock of a 737 passing 50 feet over his cab, he left his vehicle and waded through meter-deep snow to join the firefighters at the burning wreckage. He was one of the first people to reach the survivors in the tail section. 2 chains of failure ran in parallel that afternoon. One made of miscommunication, one made of mechanical design. They shared no common cause. They had nothing to do with each other. but they converged on the same 10 seconds of runway in Cranbrook, British Columbia. And in those 10 seconds, neither chain could be broken. A 10-minute error in an estimate, a 5-centimeter gap in a bucket door, and a radio call that was never made. That was the entire margin between a routine landing and a disaster that killed 43 people. If you found this video valuable, please like and subscribe. Sharing these stories is how we make sure the lessons aren't forgotten. And if you want to see what happens when a crew faces a dual-engine failure on approach with no APU, no hydraulics, and no way to stop, that story is right here.